Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome at the Romanian Cultural Institute. I'd like to start with a very solemn, serious announcement. The bar is open throughout the evening. So if you are thirsty during this conference, there is more wine, red wine, Romanian wine over there. So don't be shy. We're going to talk about a difficult topic, a sensitive topic, and I feel that we need a little bit of wine in order to be more palatable. So thank you and welcome. This is our third event in a very, very important month at the Romanian Cultural Institute. It's the month of March, when we are celebrating women achievement, when we look at womanhood from various angles, when we try to understand more about women in general, artists, intellectuals, and so on. So far, we have had two events. We started the month with an exhibition, an international exhibition, where we invited Eastern European artists, Romanian, Polish, Bulgarian, and so forth. And the exhibition is still on, so I urge you to take a look. It's called Duolingua, and it is about identity. It's about the way women, artists, negotiate their identity from the country of origin and their new identity acquired here in the United States. And there is a tension, and the tension is palpable, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. We continued last week with a portrait event, as we call it, devoted to a remarkable woman, Dr. Nina Smart, activist, writer, and most recently librettist. And we had the pleasure to premiere a couple of scenes from the opera that is now written based on her acclaimed memoirs. Yeah, over here. I'm going to start off, okay? So it's been very busy. We like to keep busy in the month of March with these events that have at the very center, various aspects of women identity and women experience. It's not all rosy in general in life, so we thought we keep a little bit more of a balance with our events. After so much celebration, let's get to a little bit of reflection. And tonight we are very, very pleased to invite you to reflect together with our guest speaker at a most sensitive topic, most difficult topic, women and extremism. It is, it's a delicate matter, but we thought it would be interesting to talk, especially now, about a topic that, in fact, is not necessarily very much researched, but it ought to be. It should be because it's important to preserve our memory. It's important to revisit the past so that we don't make the same mistakes over and over again. To understand what's happening, not only what was happening in the past with our grandparents, but possibly what's happening with us in present times. So we are doing this event not only to balance our March program, because we will come next week with a vengeance, with another huge celebration of women creativity, but because I think it's important to revisit the past and understand more about certain things that are so relevant today, and in order to advocate so that these things never happen. And mostly we like to host this event because this is a place of truth and authenticity. We really believe what Havel asked us to do, to live in truth. And I think it's the vocation, it should be a vocation of a cultural institute, to live in truth and to create this platform of debate, of conversation, even about the most sensitive topics. We will speak about extremism, mostly fascism, in interwar Romania. And it's a fascinating topic. I don't want to reveal too much because we have the perfect speaker to talk about this difficult matter. She is young, but she has brilliant credentials. She's a PhD at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. She was a researcher at New York College, one of the most prestigious research institutes in Romania, and now she is a researcher with the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. She's daring because you have to have a lot of courage, and for our friends who have been here with us throughout this month, you know we like courageous women. You know we believe that women can be so courageous. So it requires a lot of courage, a lot of daring in order to tackle this subject, in order to dig deep and to reveal a tragic and painful part of our past, of European past. And I think she is a strong candidate for one of the most hated person in extremist circles today. And we are very happy to have this hated person among us. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Anca Axinia.
Good evening. Okay, my first missions are accomplished, switching on everything I had to switch on. Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for being here. First of all, I would like to thank the Romanian Legionary Movement Institute for inviting me and hosting me. This is a great opportunity. And thank you very much to Leo for a kind introduction of my studies and my career so far. So I will start with an introduction on my topic, which is the far-right fascistic movement, however we want to call it, that was active in Romania in the interwar period. So what is now called Legionary Movement was born with the name of Legion of the Archangel Michael, this very bombastic name, also known as Iron Guard during the 1930s. And it was founded in June 1927. This is a famous image of its leader, Corneliu Codreanu, who is still very famous in all neo-extremist circles and far-right circles through Europe and beyond. The movement started as a very small, almost a group of friends, political activity in Iași, in northeastern Romania, where they met as university students and they started their political career in another very nationalist and anti-Semitic party before splitting and founding their own. From this very small circle at the beginning, they had an incredible development during the 1930s for internal and external political reasons that we will see throughout the presentation. So at the beginning of the 1930s, they moved to Bucharest, and this was a very good political move because in Bucharest was where the center of Greater Romania was all the political decisions were taken, political parties were there, the king, elite intellectuals, so this movement was an important part. So despite their violent behavior, political assassinations, and scandals involving and outlawing even, they managed to register a steady growth throughout the 1930s with a peak in 1935-1937 to reach this outstanding result at the general elections in December 1937 when they came out as third party in Romania, which was something that took by surprise all the political establishment, I think also including a bit themselves, and this brought in the end the king and the authorities to outlaw the movement and relentlessly destruct it, destroying it between 1938 and 1939. The country entered a spiral of violence. Codreanu was arrested and then, through a pretext, was assassinated in November 1938. And his death and other legionaries' death created a spiral of violence and of revenges from both sides, and it created a very difficult 2 years. However, the war started in 1939, and even if Romania was still a neutral country, things changed dramatically for the country in the summer of 1940. So Greater Romania lost some of its territories in the various diktats that were decided by the great powers, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, in the summer of 1940. So the King Carol II, left the throne, and in September 1940, a new leader came to the forefront, was the infamous general and later Marshal Ion Antonescu, who then became Hitler's main ally in Eastern Europe. And as a very unlikely alliance, what was left of the avant-garde legionary movement at the time had a new leader, a different outset. They still held the same strong beliefs, very extremely anti-Semitic and very violent. Actually, the violence of the previous years even exacerbated the violence that they experienced in their early years. These 4 months in power were very complicated. They engaged in unlawful actions against the Jewish population, murdering of political enemies, they've been their political enemies in the past, and finally they rebelled against the leader of the state, against Ion Antonescu, and these 3 days of rebellion coincided with the Bucharest pogrom, which is part of my main part of the research I am conducting at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And after these events, they were definitely outlawed, and most of the leaders fled Romania, were incarcerated, and some others actually continued their activity underground throughout the war. When I started working on women in the movement, we knew something. It was not completely a blank page, because it was observed by other researchers that one of their innovations in the Romanian political landscape in the second half of the 20s was to have a women's section. Very active, young women were involved, and even if they were very small at the very beginning, this emerged as a specific characteristic, and it grew enormously during the 1930s. We knew some aspects of Codreanu's personal life and his close family. They were a very tight family, personally and politically. So starting from these hints that we already had, that research has already given in the past decades when the work on the legionary movement has expanded in fascist studies. So I started looking at, I will group it here in 3 categories, which obviously in real life interconnect and sometimes overlap each other, but it allows me to points to some important analytical aspects of it, and also personal stories of some of the women I've encountered in this research. So the most immediate way of recruiting, especially in the very first years, women in the movement was through personal relationships. Family life was important, so sometimes sisters, mothers will be immediately involved, but also very, in a almost natural fashion, fiancés and then wives. So they will create a very strong network of tightly unified families, and sometimes even marrying each other's sisters or friends, creating a network that it will become probably one of the most vital aspects of the movement throughout the years and in the moments of outlawing, when the movement was underground and most leaders, male leaders especially, were in prison. Women and close women will keep the contact outside, they will raise money, they will kind of lead the movement and make connections between the underground organization and the leaders in prison. So the creation of these family networks were there from the beginning, and they expanded in different ways, because then the movement grew very much in the 1930s, and had to expand. But what was important, Codreanu issued a circular about it. He knew that it was important to secure women's allegiance to the Legion, and so he encouraged endogamous marriages between legionary members. This had different reasons, but the main two was that there were rumors around immorality about young women being in the same headquarters, not married. And one of the ways of avoiding this was having married women, potentially more married women in their ranks. And secondly, because the idea is that if a woman marries outside the movement, she will follow the political allegiance of her husband and not of the Legion anymore, if he is not a legionary. So the idea that you will need an internal marriage to keep all the family inside. In the mid-1930s, they had this idea from the outset, in 1928 already, to live in so-called legionary houses or homes, so to create, they had this idea very confusedly from some utopian socialists and some ideas of experimental cohabitation. Self-sufficient, so the idea of living all together in a great, in a great possession somewhere outside the city, be self-sufficient, have a vegetable garden, a church, be autonomous. Where women, men will live together, not only close families, but also with kids, with children that didn't belong to any family, but they adopted orphans. In the mid-1930s, they managed to create some of these experiments in Bucharest, where they reached a level of economic power that they were able to build one of these houses. And they will function through rotations, so legionaries will live there for a certain period of time. Some families were more stable, and they will try to create this autonomous kind of a collective living. So the idea was that they will create legionary families, which didn't mean only immediate biological family, but a kinship that was based on political relations. And this had to integrate political aspects, social aspects, raising children, but also economic aspects. So the idea that they would open cooperatives, shops, and restaurants to create an economy that was autonomous, and especially with an anti-Semitic undertone, because the idea was to take this commerce over from what they perceived to be a Jewish domination of this commerce in Romania. So they started in the mid-1930s this great business experiment. They didn't have time to develop them too much because in a few years all this has been closed down. But the first experiments in Bucharest were successful. They opened soup kitchens for workers in workers' neighborhoods. They created more. They also created more middle class places of encounter. So they managed to. They tried for a few years to make this a reality. So here I just want to show how this emerged. This is Codreanu and his wife on the day of their wedding. And as you notice, with the Orthodox crown, they put a swastika on that he already learned from Germany that it was a sign of international anti-Semitism, and they could recognize each other in different countries. And so they decorated the Orthodox crown with the swastika. And 10 years, slightly more than 10 years after, they organized a work camp. They organized work camps throughout the entire summer of 1936 and 1937 in different localities in Romania, mountainous regions, the seaside, remote villages where they will help the population with field work, agricultural work. They will build churches. They will try to do propaganda by being close to the people. And they will celebrate weddings in the camps and invite the local inhabitants of the village, and they will all become temporarily part of the legionary family. A close-up on one of the important women in this part is Codreanu's sister, Iridenta Zela Codreanu, who was married to Codreanu's closest friend and political ally, Ioni Moța, and they married in 1927, so they created this very close personal and political connection. And her path to become part of the movement was because her family was totally embedded into this reality. So even if she was a young woman in the university, she was arrested for unrest, differently from other women that one can read in archives how other women can have to justify somehow why they've been participating in these riots. They faced exclusion from university, they could lose their scholarship, which was a vital aspect of their university life at the time. And however, she had the support of her entire family for her political. If she wanted to be like her brother, she could have done it. And her father and mother will support her and her sister Silvia, even if they would be excluded from university, expelled because of political unrest, and they will have a network that supported their political activism. After marriage, she stepped a bit back from the forefront, but was very important in the underground organization when the movement was at low. Together with Codreanu's wife, Codreanu's mother, and other wives of leaders, they formed what I call the temporary elite. So for a few years, these women that came from a very non-privileged background, from the northeast of Romania, so they were not in contact, they didn't have a formal education, were the first in their families to go to university. They entered in contact with artistic, intellectual, and aristocratic elites in Bucharest, and they arrived through their political activism and through the political activism of their husbands. And then after 37 and 38, since both Codreanu and Moța died, they became revered widows. So the movement relied on them symbolically, but also politically in many ways. They were followed very closely by both police and the legions and the legionaries themselves. So this is how also how family was important in fostering first encounter with politics. Okay, now something else. No. We already mentioned that all of them, of the initial group of the movement, started from university politics. The 1920s were in Romania period of like very lively and active university politics. So it was a decade, almost an entire decade, marked by intense student activism. It started, it had many reasons and many demands. Poor infrastructural conditions, a great number of students at the university didn't have really the space, even firewood, like very basic demands that were not met by the authorities. Even if the state tried in the 1920s and 1930s to give a system of grants to allow some students from the countryside and also the first generation that went to university for the first time. This protest, especially in the University of Iași, where the movement started, were taken immediately under the wing of Codreanu and his followers that also used the anti-Semitic and strongly nationalist undertones of the protest and made them radical far-right protests, and then made out of these demands anti-Semitism and the request for numerous clauses for Jewish students one of the key points, as also elsewhere in Europe, like Hungary and sometimes even Austria. And so some of these women, the first women in the movement, not only the sisters of Codreanu, but other women of the first nucleus, and also in the 1930s at the University of Bucharest, will be university students. So here we have an environment that was a university in the 1920s and 30s, where, as I mentioned here, and I just mentioned it through just the connections between gender, age, and class, where women, even from disadvantaged backgrounds, had an opportunity through the system of scholarship I mentioned to enter university, and where they encountered a world full of student associations. So they will have one based on faculty, based on regional provenance, based on politics, based on religion, and they entered this very lively and active political world. And it was from there, the university always was a stronghold of the movement, in which women were particularly important, because if women were not allowed to vote at general elections, only a small part of them on local elections, women could vote at university elections of student leaders. So they would be making propaganda for legionary leaders, and so by the mid-1930s, as we will see, the movement managed to control the most important student associations of the main universities of the country, in particularly Bucharest, which was at the time very important, but also Cluj-Napoca. And here again we have two images that come from 10 years, like a decade difference. So at the very beginning, again, the omnipresent swastika that will kind of fade into the background slowly. But in the 20s, they were very close to this aesthetic of using peasant costumes and signal this Romanian peasant identity, whereas in the mid-1930s, also after the rise to power of Hitler and a completely new political situation in Europe, women are already using uniforms, marching in a much more militarized fashion. The fascist salute is becoming, it was adopted in Romania as well. And so also this growth of the party, of the movement, also signals how international politics impacted on not only the growth of the movement, the political ideas, but also surely the aesthetics. And one of the students, the legionaries who started their career, political career, is university student, and this also allows me to talk about her tragic end in the spiral of violence that I was mentioning at the beginning, was Nicoleta Nicolescu, who was extremely young, as you see from her date of birth, when she became, in the beginning of the 1930s, a legionary activist. She was a student at the University of Bucharest. She was from southern Romania. It's not easy to reconstruct the initial steps of her political career within the university, but we know that very, very fastly she became very close to Codreanu, and she became his personal courier, so she would be the one in charge of sending circulars and keeping communication between Codreanu and other important legionaries, and particularly in moments of crisis or with political problems. This was surely something unusual. Codreanu had a paranoid personality, so he would very rarely trust somebody so much. But he did. So this was the reason why, for the first time in 1933, Codreanu and the leadership decided to, for the first time, to give the leadership of the women's section to a woman, because before it was a man was the leader of the women's section. So women and kids and children and teenagers were grouped together. Yeah, so this was what the political maturity they expected, they imagined women had. They didn't allow for this. Also, I think, partially uneasiness of creating women leaders within the women's section. The growth of the movement and the commitment of these legionary women, their closeness to the leadership, opened a path towards this. For this to happen, and then it stayed like this until the very end, and actually even beyond 1941. So the women's section had always a women leader, what was called back then chief commander. They used this very militaristic language. And she was the one, in her first circulars in 1933-34, trying to introduce a militarized format to the women's section. So they were using uniforms, do military training, run in the morning, do drafts, learn first aid. So the idea was that even if you don't participate in active violence, you need to be ready to endure passive violence. So be ready to self-defense, clashes with the police. Even if women sometimes were prevented from doing this by male leadership, which were in the end those who decided on the bigger issues, on the most important issues. So in some more violent moments, they will be uneasy with women being at the front, but they did. So in some student congresses, they were present despite the warning that there might be clashes with the police. And her leadership, however, was not without contestation within the movement. At some point, it seemed that this militarization and this independence was maybe too much. So in the end, there were the men leaders and other close to the leadership had to reimagine again the women's section. So they in 1937, they didn't have really time for doing this. They imagined another division. This problem of women was always unsettling for them. They didn't know exactly what to do. So they wanted to create a section they were called the fanatics. That they would be an avant-garde, and they would be the ones very involved, generally unmarried and without children, so they can devote to themselves. But they really don't want this to be an expectation for all of women. This was dangerous. Like the moment when they introduced the idea that the woman can be a fighter and can fight for the Legion, and especially if she was single, she could pursue a career in the women's section, be chief leader, be organizing the summer camps, could be dangerous because in the end they also needed mothers, wives, and everything a woman could be to maintain also the society that they imagined, through the legionary societies and families that they imagined. So they wanted to create this section of fanatics that would be only an avant-garde that are more militarized, then a section of normal women, let's say like this, the more conforming more to standards, even if they imagined the idea of women working outside the house. This was kind of potentially accepted. And then a third group, it was women with dubious morality. They had to be re-educated. So they realized by the end, with the movement growing so much, that women without political training, they will join. And then some women of strict morality had to deal with these women. This division in the end never took place, which would have been very interesting to have the documents on this, but never happened. In the spiral of violence that I mentioned that slowly killed the leaders of the movement, at least some of them, Nicoleta Nicolescu also was assassinated by the police, and this made of her one of the biggest women martyrs in the legionary martyrology, if you want to call it like this. She was celebrated in 1940 during the brief moment of power of the Legion. Big ceremonies were held. Her ashes, I think they've been reburied in a new ceremony, and they managed to, from Nicolescu and other women that lost their life, they were called Nicoletas. So she also became paradigmatic of a legionary woman who, and again, this was possible to use because she was assassinated by the police and they didn't commit the violence herself. So she was a victim of violence instead of, it was an easy way of going around the issue of violence for women. And here we arrived at the part that is even somewhat more complex in a way because it involves personalities that makes this part of research challenging also. It's when the movement arrived in Bucharest, from the early 1930s, they started to have sympathies from political and artistic and intellectual and social landscapes that they were not very acquainted to in Iași. They started from groups of students. They had only one noble woman that she will support them in Iași when they were at the very beginnings. They were really penniless. So when they were in Iași, they had constant economic concerns.
And these are all fascists.
Yes.
Yeah, this group is all.
Yeah, let's see. Kind of.
Oh.
So the fact that so elites had to find different ways to get to enter the movement, because especially aristocratic elites, they had names, very famous names in the political landscape, and some others had belonged to other political parties, and their activity was surely shaped by class belonging and social networks. So they couldn't, not always too openly, show their support for religion. So what makes this important, but very easy to research, we need to go deeper. They wouldn't have a membership card, or they wouldn't sign a donation sheet of the party. And especially for women, since the class divide was even more pronounced sometimes in the case of gender, like a famous aristocrat, she wouldn't go in a work camp to cook for legionaries. They would have to divide their support in relation to their class belonging. So their support was at the beginning informal. Surely it became more formal because one of an aristocrat in Romania actually gave them his Bucharest house to become the headquarters of the Legion. So it was not always informal, but some of it was informal, and especially the financial support was informal. So in 1936, at 35-36, at the moment when the Legion reached its peak, one princess, Zoe Sturza, and a circle of other important personalities created this association called, they proposed to the Legion, they didn't create it themselves. They proposed to Codreanu that they would create a circle called the Friends of the Legion. So they will assist them financially, help them through political networks, try to intervene if problems with authorities arise, or help especially their families when they were in prison. So they will sometimes support wives and children of the legionaries when they were arrested or assassinated. So so they wouldn't immediately be recognized. Sometimes the idea was that even members of the Friends wouldn't know who belonged to it. We know from the circles that many of them knew each other and knew that they were supporting the Legion, and they were open about it among their groups, and they became very open about it in the 1940s, especially like in the first 40-41. The Sturza family is just one of the main examples when they say being legionary is the most important achievement in my life. So they were very open towards this, but at a later stage. In the 30s was not very easy. And the last part we will also explore in the close-up. It's related to some of the currents of Romanian interwar feminists, especially those more related to religious and Orthodox roots. So what we can call maybe conservative feminists. And they displayed uneasy legionary sympathy that came from a variety of reasons, religious belonging being one, family connections, but also anti-Semitism, which was a very strong feeling in Romanian aristocracy also. So among these groups, we have some famous intellectuals of the time. Cioran is not here, but Mircea Eliade is here in this group. Marieta Sadova, who was a very fervent legionary, she invited Codreanu and Suarez at her house and made her sign books, and Haida Terianu, her husband. They will be very close to the Legion in the mid-1930s. In this time, the Jewish intellectual Mihail Sebastian was still part of the group. When this picture was taken, the big separation that happened in the intellectual world didn't started to be so strong, which it became in the beginning, in the second half of the 1930s. And one of the journal of Mihail Sebastian is one of the most painful recollections of the slow but relentless separation of his Romanian friends who embraced the Legion. And among them, there were mostly their wives, their friends, Mircea Eliade's wife Nina Mareș, Mary Politroniade, who was an English translator and writer, and she also will be still active in 1941, even if her husband died already in 1939. So this is the group that has been more researched because of the presence of these very famous, internationally famous intellectuals. So this was the part where more work has been done before. Less known were, however, some aristocrats that took part in, they had sympathies for the religion, more or less open. Actually, the one that was more involved was the other one on the right, Princess Ioana Cantacuzino. They have the same, they all call Cantacuzinos because of very important, old and ramified aristocratic family in Romania. And they will support the religion at in various parts of the family at various moments and of different ages. And Princess Ioana Cantacuzino was one of them. She was very close to Marieta Sadova as well, close to the leaders of the movement, and she will help them at many different times. She will be very close to the region. She will also display this new face of the aristocracy, a modern, hyper-modern. She was an aircraft pilot, and one of the first in Romania, women pilots. And she was the new place of the aristocracy in the new Romania, created after the First World War. On this other hand, and we will have a close-up on her, is Alexandrina Cantacuzino, who belonged to a different generation. She was much older. She was born in 1876, so she lived through a first wave of feminism that was very different, and the world of politics was very different from what that happened in the 1930s and 1930s. She was internationally renowned feminist. She traveled to the United States, she traveled throughout Europe, she was in contact with suffragists throughout Europe. She had her own take on suffragists. She said that Romanian women were not ready for the right to vote. So that they will need a political education. So there is an idea of a political education that has to be achieved before reaching this moment. So they battled for an elite. So in the end, in 1929, a law has passed, and women could be elected to local councils and could vote for local councils, but not in national elections. She believed, however, that this was possible. So this was a slow educational aspect. I will start from the last part, that she knew very well fascist Italy. Some of the other feminists in her group had written some reportage from fascist Italy. They were admirers of especially the work that was devoted to the protection of women and children. That was something that was perceived as extremely progressive for the time, and if you compare it with what they perceived to be the very, very extreme poverty conditions of women in Romania and of childbirth and of high mortality, they viewed this model as an example of how can you improve life of women and small children. And they will feel closer to Italy than to Germany, especially in in the 1930s, because in Italy feminists that were already active in the liberal period, they had to adjust in a very difficult way with the regime. And they coined the strange expression of Latin feminism. It was the idea that was then also embraced to some extent in France and Spain, but Alexandrina Cantacuzino believed that it's also based on the roots that are different from the one of what she called Anglo-Saxon feminism, which are individualist and based on the gaining of rights, whereas Latin feminism was more inclined toward the peoples that were more centered around family, motherhood, and maternal feelings. So the idea was that maternity was what defined women, and in this she was in line with the maternal obsession also of fascist Italy. So she advocated the idea of Latin feminism to Romania, that she thought it could work very well also in the Orthodox context, not only in the Catholic context. Her legionary sympathies are problematic because she was never a member, she never really took part in what we imagine to be a more straightforward path. Her son was a very important legionary commander, so she had a very tight connection with what was happening in the movement. Her son was also assassinated by the police and the authorities in 1939, and this made her extremely, as we can imagine, upset with the state and how they decided to deal with the legionaries. And she even, in some writing, said that actually it was the state, that state that produced this kind of anarchism. It's not that they were violent political movement, but it was produced by a situation. And called Podriano pure soul, and she also had some, and I think Orthodox faith and anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is what connected her more closely with the religion. And this would be, yes, my wrapping up. This is a booklet. This is the only real booklet devoted to women in the region. Obviously written by men. And this is the legionary, let's call him poet and ideologue, Radojer. He is still very famous and published sometimes also in the 90s. This is already a second edition, so it was a success. Published in 1936 for the first time, and it was based on a lecture he held at the University of Iași. So we went full circle from the movement where he started. At the peak of its success, they came back to where they started at the Iași University almost 10 years afterwards. And with now a much bigger group of, the women's section has also grown enormously to the point that he could devote an entire university lecture on women, and the title is The Role of Women in Spiritual, Moral, and National Heroism. So also this very bombastic terms of using it. And here, he put together everything that the legionaries wanted from a woman, which makes them some kind of superheroes, because she could be mother, wife, comrade, a dynamic element in the spiritual momentum, and everything. So she could be, as we see here, a synthesis of Christianity, devotion, faith, selflessness, heroism, sacrifice. He even said that she can work outside the home, have kids, defend her country weapon in hand, everything. And she gives example from the Virgin Mary to Joan of Arc to everybody who comes to the mind. So he put together everything that went through the leadership's minds on how women could be integrated into the movement. But what comes out is that their desire for the need for women to be there, they realized that politically it's crucial. You can't have a political project of that wide without women. At the same time, I never call it contradiction, I don't like the term. I borrowed the term from a political philosopher and I call it disorder. They couldn't really know how to deal with the disorder brought by women in the political landscape because they envisaged a politics that was not built for women. So then you can't really integrate them without very big stretches like this one. And thank you.
Now we have another surprise. The conversation will continue on the thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I'm sure you have a lot of other things to. Alexandrina Cantacuzino. You have managed to squeeze in 30 minutes all these richness of they work, they usually.
Yeah.
You have managed to squeeze in 30 minutes all this richness of information. Of course, this is a complex topic, as you often mentioned. Why? I mean, to me, it's probably for some of the audience, it's so so amazing, so incomprehensible, the fact that these women would abandon a liberal democracy. Of course, an imperfect system, but still a democracy. They would gladly, fanatically abandon democracy in favor of something that was openly defined as totalitarian, as encompassing every aspect of life, as being about tyranny, as being about suppression, as being about dictatorship. Why on earth did these women want to join an extremist movement like that and didn't believe in liberal democracy and in democracy at all? Why?
Thank you, Dorian, for maybe it's also too strong. Thank you for this question. Yes, what I think the biggest pain I have in my research is that the voices of these women are very rarely registered, like their own voices. They very rarely wrote articles. They did sometimes, I can talk about it a bit. But we have circulars, like the one of the leader Nicoleta Nicolescu. However, through their stories and their political paths and the choices they made also at university when they were university students, and the idea that they continued with this in the movement until actually losing their lives. So this is already a sign of extreme commitment, since you also mentioned it. In Romania, at the time, as you know, the liberal democracy was not only imperfect, it was virtually newborn. It was extremely new, something that has happened for a few years. Women still didn't have access to full emancipation, so they couldn't vote in national elections. They were kept outside of politics from most political parties that were rooted in old-fashioned, let's call them old-fashioned politics from the liberal times. So I think when they encountered these movements within universities, it was the first time they encountered politics as we imagine it today. Activism, being heard, being part of something, having ideals, and I don't believe that in the few years between the end of the First World War and the establishment of the new system in Romania, they had time to really experience what this democracy was really, especially since they didn't have access to it immediately. And we can't not consider geographical provenance, class. Some of the women that started the group were coming from remote regions, like distant from Bucharest, sometimes in the countryside. They were the first of their families to go to the city. Anti-Semitism played an important part. We can't say this enough. Anti-Semitism was widespread in the Moldavia region. Iași and surrounding had I would call it unfortunate tradition in Iași. And so the city had already an established anti-Semitic feeling that was extremely exploited then by political parties. And the Legionary Movement is only one of them. They were several, actually a lot of them. So the fact that they felt, and then the Legion started to create a women's section, which was not very usual for movements at the time. Some other political parties started doing it after they did it. And they took inspiration from Jewish associations sometimes. Codreanu mentioned it, that he saw Jewish women that are very organized in Zionist movements, but also in philanthropic associations and in political associations. And he said, look at them, they can do it. why shouldn't Romanian women also organize this? So he had this intuition that he needs a women's section in the party. He didn't know, from what I gathered so far in my, I was actually saying before almost a decade and I don't want to think about it, but it's that they experimented with this political, with taking women as political companions, let's call it like this.
The figures of pogrom is obviously central in the history of the Legion, Iron Guard, and you cannot think of the Legion without this cult figure. Because of him, the Legion looked very much like a religious movement, like a cult, and he was like a sort of religious figure, cult figure, sort of great priest of a sort of renewal. What were his opinions about women, if he did express them? Not only that he wanted to have a women's section, but also what he did believe about women at the time.
The idea of him being this kind of religious figure was probably also a bit exaggerated. I think he relied also a lot on very good other politicians that helped him at the local level and assisted them in more refined political matters, and encounters with elites that could also provide an economic background was very important. So I think also this social research that has been more important in the past years, and also informed my research also how to see the system, why the Legion worked was a bigger system. So with only Quadrano it wouldn't have been possible in general. However, he took all the decisions. So in the end, despite as much as we can understand the functioning of a political party with many factors, in the end, he was the one deciding on the directions to give to the Legion. In this sense, I think the main part of the formal writings was that he needed to look respectable in the political landscape where he was. Where he couldn't say that we want to have women that are just political leaders. It was, and he didn't even believe it. However, in practice, in practice, however, he will have, like, the movement, the women's section would rely on women who devoted themselves to the movement, and some of the time they do have children, some of them get married, some not. In the end, it was not important. However, he had an anxiety, which was not only his. The male anxieties within the movement were widespread. This is also one of the reasons why the women's section every year and a half, 2 years, had a reorganization. One of the reasons was the numbers. They were becoming bigger and bigger. But it was not only a reorganization that was organized from the point of view of grouping and logistical aspect, but ideological. So you have to always kind of refashion. First you put them under a man leader. Then you say, okay, maybe we need a woman. Now we have to, they reach this maturity. We have people we trust, we have women we trust, we can make them commanders. At the same time, they can't all become commanders, and they can't all abandon the path to motherhood and being a wife. So then you have to divide this again. So I think his ideas also changed throughout time, facing situations, and when he encountered women from the elites, he encountered a world that he never experienced before, because he was not coming from a native background. So he encountered women, princesses who piloted aircraft, and Marietta Sadova, who had salons, who was very embarrassed at her house. It was not a socialite. But the women's section was an experiment that I developed in ways that I think even escaped his initial ideas on more traditional, what we imagine, where just, and especially because he was talking with.
This is a mic against Kotlin. As a new battery, you need some battery
to talk about him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, I mean that in the end he needed to experiment with it. Surely, I mean, he was not in any way a feminist. Let's call it like this. This is not possible. He needed women to create what he imagined to be the legionary world of tomorrow, the legionary utopia, or whatever. This kind of takeover and parallel society, and sure, women could work out of the house. This was a big debate in Romania anyway. Like in the 30s, everybody was talking about if universities were good or bad for women. And since his center of recruitment was universities, it was difficult to not even accept the idea that women at least have to study or have a job outside the house. So he had to put together all this. In his more formal writings, he's generally more moderate and more conservative towards it, yeah.
But the 30s are generally in Romania and elsewhere in Europe a time of huge polarization. You have the far-right movement, but at the same time you have the far-left movement. So what was, because we talk about extremism, and of course the bulk of your research is far-right extremism, you for sure have encountered the far-left communist extremism in your research. What was the situation on the far left with the women? How present were the women? What were the motivations to join the far left movement, which were, as we know so well, far less influential at the time?
They said, look, we need this nationalism. We need this nationalism to be to function because we need it for creating a country. We just have to cut the extremists or turn it towards our own goals or redirect it in different ways. So the state was responsible for the growth of the movement until a certain point when it was too late, and then the reaction of the king was to kill them all. So they tried at different times to control it. Codreanu killed a police prefect in Iași, and legionaries killed a prime minister, Ion Giduca, in 1933. It was an extremely serious attack on democracy. They were imprisoned, yes, but the movement recreated itself within a year. And the far left, as we know, they were outlawed, and communist demonstrations at the universities already in the 1920s were destroyed with extreme force, and all students were immediately expelled. There was no way of going around, no pardon possible, so the state was very relentless towards communists. And surely the presence of Jewish students and Jewish youth would have been a deterrent for some ethnic Romanian students, or Orthodox or Christian. However, they call themselves Christians to differentiate themselves from Jews. So, in my opinion, but I think it's now something that has been researched on the movement so far, the role of this tolerant behavior of the state was partially responsible, also because they capitalized a lot on even political assassinations, and in the end they were never punished, but so until the end. And then when you arrive in 1938 and the only way is to assassinate 200, 300, you create a spiral of revenge and violence, and then also the state couldn't hold its accountability anymore because you just shot people in the street, so then you don't maintain your respectability anymore. So you also create this kind of distance then from politics, yeah.
Talking about violence, I think violence is very important in a movement like this, right or left. There is a sort of exaltation of violence, the necessity of violence, the imperative of violence. How were, and you have, of course, throughout the 20s and 30s, you have violent episodes, right? You have assassinations, you have riots, you have beatings and so on, clashes with the police and authorities. But the biggest violent moment is, of course, the rebellion. They are in government. They want to take the power, the absolute power, the entire power, and they rebel against their partner, General Antonescu, trying to remove him from power and govern by themselves. And there is a famous, you mentioned the 3 days of violence, of killings, of clashes with the military. How present were the women during these 3 days of extreme violence, of shooting, of, I would say, civil war?
Yes, thank you very much for this question, because this is why I started this research. When I read for the accounts of the rebellion, and in particular the pogrom that was unleashed in the same days, we know it comes out in accounts, especially in relation to the pogrom, that legionary women have been extremely violent, present on the ground.
Like physical
violence, yes.
What did they do?
Beatings, robbery, mostly beatings, or being present at beatings and killings of Jews, inhabitants of Bucharest, shootings, not shooting guns, it's more being present, or not any of them, from what I know so far, have been trialed for having shot herself, but being part of groups that were rounding up the Jews in Bucharest and shooting them in the outskirts of Bucharest, or being present at the houses where the tortures were happening, so being physically there. And since this was, going back to the account, it emerges that they were present. There were no real indication on how we knew that there were so many present. Like even in the sources that were mentioned in various accounts, there were some accounts from 1945-46, very old, but also uncertain on establishing the numbers or even names, or so we have very few traces on what really happened. And then going through diaries from the time of some Jewish intellectuals, they mentioned that there were women, there were rumors of legionary women involved. This doesn't even show the number, because women present at this kind of extreme violence, even a few of them would create a rumor of this kind, because it was unexpected for women to be involved in this extreme violence, and sometimes it still is. It's not something that we actually completely gone beyond. Even if, especially because the pogrom happened in January 1941, it was far before what will happen in the east with Operation Barbarossa, so the massive pogroms and shootings and participation of local population in pogroms and massive assassination. So this was before all that. So they didn't have even in mind the idea that this could be a reality despite all the anti-Semitism display. So it was mentioned, like if a person was survived, like we have a testimony of someone survived a shooting, for example. If they were rounded up in a house, they will notice, they will write down, there was a woman, a legionary woman, 2 legionary women, because it will stand out among all the men, and in this situation they will emerge as unexpected figures to be there. We know now that this was very common, obviously, in the Nazi East, in fascist Italy. The trials are even more detailed. The main difference also in Romania that creates a very unique almost way of what we call now transitional justice, because the first transition was in an Antonescu regime, so already still an anti-Semitic, strongly anti-Semitic regime. So
still an enemy of the region.
So they wanted, so immediately after the rebellion and the pogrom, they wanted to punish the legionaries, but to tone down the anti-Semitic aspect of it, because they will even, like in a few weeks, even more anti-Semitic measures came out in a city that was devastated in its Jewish neighborhoods, and the population was shocked still, and in a few months afterwards, the anti-Semitic legislation was increased enormously, also in preparation of the new alliance with Hitler and Operation Barbarossa. So what followed in the summer of 41 was then extreme. So the first moments of transition, what we call now transitional justice, was very lousy in a sense. So they wanted to have the leaders of the movement, and surely very few women were arrested in this sense, and some criminals. There is one case that I have followed. It was the mayor of a village in the outskirts of Bucharest. He was a legionary mayor, and his wife also was a legionary, and they were a legionary couple. They formed a legionary family, and he was not present in the village. He was in Bucharest in the midst of the rebellion. She was in this small town called Jilava. The name was a village actually. And together with the legionaries from the small village and the surroundings, deciding what to do. And some Jews the story is it's complex. So they rounded up around 90 people, 90 Jews. They were brought to the forest and shot outside of Bucharest. 7 or 8 Jews managed to escape the first shooting, and they wake up in the morning. This happened at night, 3-4 in the night. In the morning, at the first lights, it was, imagine January's freezing cold, dead bodies, very extreme scenario. The survivors tried to walk towards Bucharest, even if it was very difficult to go back. Unfortunately, most of them ended up at the town hall of Jilava, in the mayory. So they were caught by the legionaries there, imprisoned, and brought again to the killing site the night afterwards to be finally assassinated. Because, especially in the second day, they knew they would lose the rebellion, that Antonescu will never give up power, and especially Nazi Germany in the end beat Antonescu. So they had this opening to reality that they realized probably they knew that nothing would can be successful. So they didn't want the witnesses to recognize them and see them. So they made this very long decision, like they calling to Bucharest, receiving calls from other leaders, what to do with them. And the mayor's wife was there in the decision process. She was arrested almost immediately. Not for shooting herself, even if there were rumors about something like that. She was also at the killing scene, which I think it's unlikely from the trials that I've seen. But she prepared the actual cartridge. At the time they were made by hand, so she brought a hunting gun, and she will make the cartridges that are necessary for this. With I don't know how you make them, but I know that at the time they were made by hand. And so she was arrested as well because it was part of the group that decided to assassinate the Jews. And there are a key witness because one of the Jews was a rabbi in Bucharest, survived also the second shooting. So this was an incredible story. And in the end, he was caught again, but the rebellion was almost over, and he was saved by the police, by the real, let's call it like the lawful police in the morning of the end of the rebellion. So he was a key witness in 41 in these trials that she received only 5 years because of complicity in assassination. And then the case was reopened again between 1947 and 1952. So she had a second, and she was not only her, there were other women involved, but mostly escaped trial in one way or another because they were not directly responsible, let's call it. Even if she was considered morally responsible in the second trial that was held in a completely different political setting. And she was tried to 15 years for crimes against humanity. She never served them, obviously. She was she was left free in 1955 after a few, but she served in prison 7 or 8 years, which is sometimes even more than some much bigger criminals in the war. So she, in the end, the justice at least tried to establish this.
In 1947, you have the communist dictatorship is imposed, the Stalinist version of it. I wonder what happened with these women who are so active in politics and on the far right and involved in violence, some of them, or at least helping the perpetrators of violence. What happened with these women during the first years of communism and later?
So we know the cases that are more renowned, like Maria Pasadova was arrested much later because she received papers from Eliade from Paris, and like the most famous cases are her husband died on the front, so he was not involved anymore. So she remained kind of alone in her allegiance to her former group of friends, and they were very close personally, really. So apart from political connections, but so she ended up in these groups. Ioana Cantacuzino, I can just say the fates that I know better. She was also not imprisoned at the beginning, but then what was called at the time forced domicile, so she had to live secluded in a place. She was first, I think, in Bessarabia, and then allowed to go back to her mansion somewhere in the countryside. Not imprisoned, but she had a kind of house arrest. Others had, like, even if she was not a supporter, but also Octavian Goga's wife didn't receive, despite her Nazi sympathies, big, extremely harsh punishments. It was kind of a toleration towards some of the women that were not too involved in the political aspect of the movement. Codreanu's wife was arrested in many different times. But she remarried, if I remember correctly. I never followed this. We have only another thesis to follow their lives afterwards. But I know she lived until the 80s. She worked in a tobacco factory. She recreated another. But also Codreanu died before the war and everything and the rebellion. So he was kind of as bad as he was for the regime. He was not also involved in the last most crucial 41, and also the underground that was very active between also until 43 maybe, but 44 even still. And some of the women, the one that I mentioned, that was in the pogrom, she was followed very closely, like especially at the local level. So this is why I'm starting doing this, and this is part of my research at the Holocaust Museum, but it has to be done in Romania, especially by other researchers, and probably in the future. At the local level, authorities really try to find the criminals. Also, more of the example of East Germany, like to be more relentless in the punishment. Surely they had political motivations, but also there was a law on crimes against humanity, what was coming out from the Nuremberg trial, so the idea of crime against humanity was in place. Didn't last long, because in the end, at some point, they needed what they see kind of closure. And so in 55, the law was abrogated, and so she was arrested, and she was trialed again in a very long, detailed trial. And as we mentioned, she was arrested for crimes against humanity, and she was considered morally responsible, which was a term that was used sometimes in studies on women collaborators only very recently, like in the 90s, the idea of moral responsibility. So you could say, I was just a wife, I was at home. So the idea that you didn't know and the idea that you didn't participate was not believed by in the trial, that she didn't know. It was not possible, really, at least in her case. What we notice in the trials of this time is that political commitment was more important sometimes. They don't mention with much insistence her gender. In other trials in Western Europe, it happens more often that her gender is remarked upon during the trial. This doesn't emerge as its central aspect, political conviction. So the idea, which is also a message that has to be passed in the new political setting, that women are politically committed and they act upon their political commitments. They are not minors, or they think only what their husbands think. So the idea that was she made a conscious decision. This is also why another woman in the same trial, who contributed to the assassination of a Jewish boy by denouncing him to the authorities, her case was dismissed. Because yes, she denounced it, the boy, but she didn't know exactly, or she was not what would happen with him. She might fear authorities, but the main aspect was that she wasn't not a legionary. She was not. Nobody in the village could say she might have been anti-Semitic, yes, but this was something that went beyond what the court could decide. So the political commitment was crucial in the trials.
Because you have dealt so much on extremism and on mobilization in extremism movement and radicalization, do you discern a sort of pattern, like a general pattern that can be applied to other movements, and not only in the interwar period, of course, but later extremist movements? Because unfortunately we have had part of them throughout the decades. Is there something that you would, rising above the interwar period and the case of the Legion, that you would see in other patterns of radicalization, of winning in extremism movement?
Yes, thank you for this question, which is one of the important aspects. It's how can we learn, what can we do, or how can we prevent this? Surely the situation was, the political context is crucial. Sometimes it's not really possible to generalize or replicate in the sense this is the path that women follow, because it depends and also within interwar Europe, movements on the far right had different political contexts in which they developed and incorporated women in different ways. So this is for sure important. One aspect that I will say is that, in my opinion, the fact that authorities at the time were permissive to some extent towards them, and this happened sometimes because the ideas that they believe in are an extremist version of what is also believed in the society at large. So they don't invent, they exaggerate or they extremize features that exist and are acceptable and accepted by a majority. So this is some aspect of tolerance that are towards some aspects of it, because in the end, if you want to dismantle the extremism, you have to tackle also how to dismantle it at a more general level. So if you want to really, if you want to talk about nationalism in a conscious way and how the relationship with women with politics, it requires a deeper diving into political philosophy and also what it means for women to be a citizen of a state, since it was so hard to get the right to vote, and it is hard today to do many things on an equal level. So the idea is that surely there is also an aspect of being incorporated in the far right, in particular, into a men's world. So you have this empowerment that comes from this making your way into a world that is male-dominated, but you manage, and it creates a path that is different from what maybe the expectations of society were towards yourself, where there are personal motivations for sure that it's not easy to dig in this part, and especially in the interwar period, it was more visible because women were not so visible on the political scene. Sure, later on, the reasons are more diverse, and surely I would stay vague on this aspect because it's not easy to do it without a context. But sometimes some extremist movements or far-right movements that we have today around us in the world have also accepted some aspects of historical feminism because they can't go back completely. Like there are new terms for it, which is reactionary emancipation. So there is a part of gains that can't be brought back. So they have to be accepted. So it creates also a sort of, they are not so anti-women as they were perceived at the beginning. Sure, they don't expect emancipation, or they're not feminists, because especially there is also, and most importantly, I think I can't stress it enough, anti-Semitism was crucial in the movement. There's also the fact that women felt empowered in the Legion. It's because women from other women, not only non-Romanian, but especially Jewish women, couldn't. In the imagination of a legionary world, they had to be expelled from Romania. So the idea was that in the end, you can gain something different because someone else will be turned out, and it's the same with other groups throughout history. And it happened actually in some countries like Hungary in the 20s, when Jews actually were limited to university, more women got into university. So you create this unexpected, unwanted almost emancipation of a group, but because you are doing it from another. So you put together disenfranchised groups and play on potential conflict between them. So it's also a way of empowering, but not in a feminist sense, but by also excluding a part of the population, whatever it's your political enemy, from taking part in this emancipation.
So I think you have stressed an important idea that there is a limit to the tolerance a state can take towards this kind of extremism, and sometimes this tolerance it's inevitable because the mainstream is in fact, the core ideas are just the same, while the way they were expressed, it was in a more extreme way, and the means were more violent. And I think it's a very, very powerful idea. I'd like now to, with your permission, to open the floor. We're going to take a few questions over there.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you. That's very interesting. I don't know much about Romania, but what's the political situation now? And are there women in government, leadership? What kind of government is it? Democracy now? Or?
Oh yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't know much about.
It's let me. I'm going to answer that. So it's in it's the job description. So, no, I mean it's since 1989. With difficulties, it's become a liberal democracy. We are part of the European Union, a multi-party system, elections. All the features of a democracy. Women have been in power as ministers, as leaders, as MPs, member of the parliament, or in other functions. Of course, they dominate the university, the school, the education. Probably not that much in the economy, but definitely intellectual life, arts, politics to a certain extent, with variation. Of course, there is a lot of, always you can improve that, but definitely a democracy, definitely a very, we have several minorities, so we are very, the laws are very strict with regard to minorities, and also if you look at the communist time, in communist time, it's a long discussion, but women by policy were brought into very influential positions. That was the policy of the state. So you could, for decades, you could have found women in powerful position, in leadership position. after 1989, of course, it wasn't that difficult, so they didn't need to reinvent, you know, this kind, because of course you have had women leaders all around. But of course, like always and everywhere, there is room for improvement. You can do things much better. You can bring in more women. You can do more about it. But definitely. I mean, it's a very different. It's a different society that the society described by Anca, the interwar.
Thank you.
Sorry about that, Anca, but I'm always in love to speak about Romanian democracy.
But it's under threat, isn't it? Right
Sorry?
now. It's under threat right now with the elections.
Yeah, it's a center-right government, isn't it?
No.
But it's a center.
Sorry?
It's a centrist government right now.
Yes, it is. It's a coalition between a center left and the center right party, with the support of the party of the Hungarian minority. So it's a coalition. We are a country of party of coalitions in government. It's a very fragmented political landscape.
Parliamentary system.
Yeah, it's a semi-presidential system. It's more complicated than that. But it's a coalition of, you know, two colors and the minority party.
So I want to understand a little more clearly. So at the time when this fascist women movement, let's not call it feminist because they really weren't feminist. They believed in hearth and home and women supporting their men that were fighting against the Jews and all that. The main government was a monarchy, right? And so the monarchy was kind of caught between the communists and the fascists. And then, of course, when Hitler got into power, the fascists were all very happy, and they were supporting them with expected collapse of the government, which happened. And the Nazis were in power. And then, at one point, the communists were perceived as sort of a savior of sorts, getting rid of the Nazis. Then you get, of course, Ceausescu, and you have what you're trying to say is, did the women that were part of the fascist movement shift over to Ceausescu's government and become part of the women that were incorporated, or were they still opposition fighting against communists?
Thank you. Oh wow, this is it covers
Did I
a long
describe
time.
it correctly?
The fact that some of these women, like in the first years of the Romanian decades, let's call it like this, like between 45 and the 70s, in 30 years, like some of them left Romania, women and men, legionary men ended up in South America, in Canada. Some women and legionary men and women ended up in Franco Spain, and lived in Spain, the leader of the movement until the 90s, so he was the fascist.
Element.
Yes. So the fascists, some of them fled Romania entirely, so they kind of have their lives elsewhere. Some women ended in monasteries of nuns, so they will. It was not crazy. It was they were also confined there. It wasn't like when they were arrested in massive numbers in 1938 and 1939. They were sometimes put into the custody of nuns because they didn't have prisons with women guards. So there was this idea that it was very dangerous to put women in men's hands, and they wanted this the danger of sexuality was too much. So they didn't want to put women in the same with the other legionaries, and some of them were imprisoned in Bucharest, the important ones. Some others were put into the custody of in some monasteries, and some of them stayed in monasteries. And there is some footage, more contemporary ones, of nuns even today singing legionary songs, because it kind of stayed in the memory, and also they are kind of nice tunes. So they said that the nuns they sometimes perform this chants still today. I would assume that even hardcore legionaries in the 40s were in between also to the more extreme communists. They would go from one side to the other. This is a story that still has to be understood in its details, but we know that there were some transitions, especially between workers, steel workers, railway workers. There would be some encounter at the extremes. I wouldn't say in big numbers, but surely they were. Like hardcore legionaries, maybe not, but there were some encounters. For women, I think they integrating in the new society, they were followed, however, for a long time. I have a case, I stepped into a case that she was, I encountered the name because she was in the rebellion. She didn't do much. She had to hold a gun or was arrested for being physically present in a factory. But then she was followed until the 80s. Like police kept following her closely until the Securitate until the 80s. So it's a lot, but she was never then in prison. She was left out, but under the eye. So some of them had a kind of normal life, but also the paranoia of the regime never, even into the 80s, mid-80s, they were still following these legionaries. They were now old and not even close to this power anymore, but they were still followed. But they will live. In like also the woman that was arrested and sentenced to 15 years of prison, she was released after a few years, in 55. So she could go back. She was already almost 60 years old. They didn't consider her to put a political threat to the country, so she was released from prison and lived her life afterwards. I don't know when she died, but yeah, we can assume that she had a normal life afterwards, kind of normal. Sometimes, yes, you could be followed, at least just to know what you're doing by the police. Yes, they would be under the eye.
But I would add that Ceausescu came in 1964, 1965 in power. By then, almost 20 years.
With the communists.
With the communists, he wasn't that important. I mean, he wasn't the leader of the party until the middle of the 60s. So by then, of course, the former Legion members, as Anca said, were either abroad in various countries in the world, or were living a life under the radar. Yeah, I think it's important to say that you could never have, with very few exceptions, very rare exception, you couldn't have a career and a full life under communism with that kind of past.
Got it.
We know that some intellectuals, some artists, for instance, I come from a city called Timișoara, it's in western part of Romania. And the first, as a kid, as a teenager, I didn't learn much about the Legionary Movement because it was kind of taboo subject, or presented in a sense that was totally, incomprehensible. But one of the characters of Anca's story ended up in my city. And the first time I heard about the Legion in a more comprehensible way was when I heard that this fantastic lady, the creator of the Timișoara theater movement, who revolutionized in the late 50s and throughout the 60s the theaters. Because I would meet some of the directors, or let's say that because of my life, I was in that milieu. And I would hear, oh my God, Marietta did that, Marietta did that. Was Marietta Sadova? Of course, I didn't know at the time that Marietta Sadova. But then somebody said, of course, Marietta in 1940 was at the roof of the National Theatre in Bucharest, shooting her machine gun. That was, how come, Marietta, the creator of the Timișoara Theatre and Timișoara Troupe, was in 1940 on the roof of the National Theatre in Bucharest, shooting a machine gun. It was, that was, my first cognitive dissonance. I thought it was a sort of performance, wow, they were doing fantastic things in 1940s in Bucharest. Later did I learn, of course, about her past, about the fact that she was, of course, marginalized for many, many years, and then slowly recuperated in the social life, but not in a very prominent place. She was a theater director in Timișoara, but because she was so powerful, Anca Diana, her husband who died on the front, sent by General Antonescu to die there, because that was one of the punishments, was a theater director, famous in the 30s, and a very good theoretical mind. So through Haig died, Marietta resurfaced in the 60s, and because resurfaced, sort of the theories of Haig resurfaced as well, and they created this fantastic theatrical movement in a provincial town. So that was, but Marietta always kept a low profile, and never was more prominent than a provincial theater director. Of course, for the general public, for those who knew her, maybe it was another thing. And you see, decades later, you got this kid, talking about her in New York City. History is so strange.
Something on Marietta. Like the journal that I mentioned of Michael Sebastian was this Jewish intellectual, very brilliant. It was the Jewish friend they had in the group, so that was slowly excluded. He observed Marietta very well. They knew each other very well. His belief, despite what he was witnessing, it was that she was doing this for ambition more than ideological commitment. We will probably never solve this. We don't know if Sebastian wanted to believe this, because they were very close friends and he couldn't put up with the idea that she would embrace extremist anti-Semitism. And it was very hard for him, especially because he knew that Eliade and his wife became very strong legionaries in a very committed sense. Whereas Marietta and Haig were, he thought that they were thinking about something that could happen in Romania like in Germany, and they would become some top intellectuals in a regime, in a far-right regime. And he believed maybe to, console himself that not all his friends have turned, even if supporting them of ambition is not even much nicer actually, but at least he could feel that he had this try to figure out why all this, his friends were slowly doing this, and he kind of believed that differently from Eliade's wife, Nina, that was a tragic story because they were both in love with her, blah blah, very long gossip, but also they were very strong legionaries, and he knew this. And whereas with Marietta he was ambivalent, even if he was the victim of this, and he said that maybe more her ambition than her beliefs, which doesn't make her better, but he tried to find ways to understand what was going on in their minds, also how ambition could work, could be one of the motivations. Yes, it could be a great motivation.
Well, I hadn't met her. It was just the echoes of another time that were reaching me. And of course, I wouldn't ask you whether she was on the roof of the National Theatre in 1940. We are going to take one last question over there.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. This is more broad, not regarding just women. I have a question regarding Romania's political situation right now. So the Venice Commission got founded, I think, in 1999, and Romania adopted it in 2002. My question is why, and what does the Venice Commission think about Borgescu's, I think I'm butchering his name. Yes. What do they think about his
welcome at the Romanian Culture Institute, where culture and arts are king. I think you should ask these kind of questions somewhere else. We're doing culture and arts here. I don't want to be diplomatic, but really, I don't think it's the right place to. We can talk about Marieta Sadova, Haiga Terian, Corneliu Zelea Codreanu. Of course, we can think of other, be inspired by the conversations here and think of other things, but yeah, what can I say? It's if it's something related to, Dr. Axinia is very competent in everything related to the interwar fascist movement. So please ask anything about that. Thank you anyhow for the question.
There's one more question.
Yeah, over there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was wonderful and we learned so much. What I want to ask is, in your archival research, did you find like testimonies or any kind of documents from like villagers, because you had that wonderful picture of a wedding, right? And so like what was kind of the sentiment among villagers towards this movement of like women on the side of the legionary movement? Thank you so much.
What do you mean by wonderful picture?
No,
It's a historical document.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Thank you very much. This is a very good question because we would like to know much more about what locals thought about it. It's not easy because in the regions where they traveled for these work camps, there were a very wide illiteracy rate. It's more probable that what we know of what was going on was from police accounts that were collecting impressions among the population. What I know from all these police accounts is that it functioned, it worked. The idea of their being there, it struck a chord in the parts of they chose remote regions because to show how the state actually, despite its nationalistic, bombastic words, was not really going to the soul of the people. So they will go in high mountains, remote regions, the seaside, the seaside coast, the Black Sea coast was another important part, but the mountains especially as a place of quintessential Romanianness and also of the state forgetting, to a point that even the Orthodox Church had to prohibit their participation in rebuilding churches because they couldn't substitute authorities. So when you go into, they will even help with agricultural work, so they will do the jobs with them. And women working in a village is normal. It wouldn't have been so. The village work relies in an agricultural society on women's work. So women being there wouldn't have seemed strange. If they were uniforms, I assume yes. They had the idea that women should go and do propaganda in the countryside together, like a couple of women going around in the village and doing propaganda. I suspect this didn't happen too much because of uneasiness of women alone talking about politics, but the presence of women wouldn't have seemed too strange in an agricultural landscape where women worked in the fields anyway, and especially cooking. They were cooking a lot in the camps. So yeah.
At what time was this then?
36, 37.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There is another one here, the last one.
Just a quick observation. How much connection actually was between the Nazi movement in Germany, and that included also the women's movement? And the other curiosity I have in Germany, the Bund Deutscher Mädchen. Was there any connection between the women's movement there and the Romanian movement? Because I know there was a lot of interchange always between Romania and Germany. It goes back history. So I'm curious about that.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a very good question because there were relations with other far-right parties around Europe. So one of the legionaries did its PhD in Rome, so he could study the fascist economy. They will do student congresses, international student congresses in Italy. So with all delegates from fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Romanian delegates from the far right parties. They will encounter each other. The Nazi party was more involved with the German ethnic population of Romania. So they will send Nazi educators and organizers in the Siebenbürger and all the parts where the German community stayed, and sometimes were conflicted with the Legion that were supporting the Romanian population there, which was in their opinion underdeveloped in comparison with the economical development or of German nationals and Jews in Transylvania, for example. So there was this, the communist regime built this idea that they were a fifth column of the Nazi and they supported them all around their development. This turned out was not the case. Surely they had connections, the ideological connections, but Hitler didn't care too much. And he obviously preferred Antonescu as a political ally because he could guarantee the stability of the army. It could be a reason. They were, especially in the 1940s, they were not reliable anymore from the point of view also of leadership. And they didn't even have the political acumen to become.
I was thinking of the earlier period.
The earlier periods,
20s, 30s.
20s, no, they will go to Germany to learn something. This is how they brought the swastikas back to Iași from trips to Germany in the beginning of the 1920s. But the connections that we don't know never happened to me, that it never occurred to me that I found a trip of of Nazi organizations directed to the Legion itself. To Romania, because of the German minorities, so it was in the folk, it happened. We know delegates from Nazi Germany going to fascist Italy, and at some point also in Franco Spain, and we know this interconnect. When regimes were established, it happened more. We know that far-right students came from or young teenagers came from Poland and from other countries. The research has also focused more on the German communities, that it might be one of the reasons why we know much better, and we knew that the Nazi Party was interested in Germans all over Europe. And so they will engage in this with money and with engagement, but that sometimes created conflicts actually with the Legion. So it was a complex issue because theologically you can have something in common, but on the ground, at the local level, some communities will compete for resources. So it will create also some difficulties, and so we don't know so far. Maybe we could dive more. But I wouldn't be positive with the idea that they will send delegations to meet specifically with the Legion. We don't know about this. I don't think so.
I'm just curious between the women's organizations. No?
I would say no. Like my take on it, I haven't found anything so far. I hope the research will go on, not only mine, but of other people on specific aspects. Student movements will be a key aspect in this, university politics. Because they traveled more, and we know they went to congresses in Europe, and they've met. But delegate, to visit like they did with the Sección Femenina in Franco, Spain, it was more difficult because it was not state-sponsored. It was a fringe movement sometimes. It was more difficult for them to do this.
We're going to meet tomorrow evening at 7 p.m., okay? And Sunday evening at 7 p.m. And in between, we're going to spend all the weekend together to talk about these topics, but unfortunately, there are other nice things to do during the weekend. I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. The time, don't hesitate to see the exhibition. It's a very nice exhibition. Follow us on internet, on social media, and subscribe to our newsletter. There are so many things that we are doing here at the Romanian Cultural Institute. The least of it being talking about